This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. This week, who were the existentialists and why do we still care about them? Sarah Bakewell is here to talk about how existentialism came to be. Her book is At the Existentialist Café.
They were very influenced by Kierkegaard in the previous century, who talked about the dizziness of freedom. The fact that we're free gives us a kind of vertigo, because you're literally sort of almost looking over this cliff of all the possibilities that you have.
Publishing legend Blanche Knopf was one of the most feared and respected women of American letters. Liesl Schillinger will join us to talk about The Lady with the Borzoi, Blanche Knopf, literary tastemaker extraordinaire.
When people wonder if she really was pulling her weight equally in Knopf or even more, at least according to this biographer, and she seems to have lots of good backup, Blanche was inseparable from its rise and from really its endurance.
Alexandra Alter will have literary news, and Greg Cowles will talk bestsellers. Here's some fun news. Inside the New York Times Book Review podcast is turning 10. Our 10th anniversary celebration will be an event here at the Times on April 28th with former host Sam Tannenhouse, podcast founder and current book critic Dwight Garner, and Gary Steingart, our very first podcast guest. And for our listeners, we're giving away 10 guest passes. Email us at bookreviewgiveaway@nytimes.com. We'll be randomly selecting 10 listeners to attend our live podcast celebration with a guest, hosted here at the New York Times. For the full giveaway rules, visit nytimes.com/books. The giveaway closes on April 17th, and prize winners will be notified within a few days. Sarah Bakewell's written vividly about the 18th century, including a biography of Michel de Montaigne. Her newest book is about the existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Edmund Husserl, and Martin Heidegger, among many others. She plants us squarely in their world, Europe between the two world wars and just before them. And she looks at how the questions they pondered then about the meaning of life resonate again today. Sarah Bakewell is here now. Her latest book is called At the Existentialist Café, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails. Hi, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
All right, you have to explain that title.
Well, the apricot cocktails, I guess, is
the thing that sticks out.
Most needs explaining. Well, that refers to a story which starts my book off, which is told to us by Simone de Beauvoir. So she and her boyfriend at the time, Jean-Paul Sartre, and boyfriend of the next 50 years, I might add, were sitting in a cafe in about late 1932, early 1933, with an old school friend of Sartre's who'd just come back from Germany, and that was Raymond Aron. And he'd been studying philosophy there. And he'd particularly been studying a new kind of philosophy called phenomenology. And that basically was a method which enabled you to just start philosophy by describing whatever experience you were having at the time, rather than with a theory, sort of an elaborate abstraction. Since they were sipping apricot cocktails at the time, he said to Sartre, "You see, my little friend," which was their old pet name for each other, "you see, mon petit camarade, if you are a phenomenologist, you can philosophize about this apricot cocktail. You can start from this." And that was so exciting to Sartre as a new approach to philosophy that was just starting with the here and now. And he rushed off to the nearest bookshop and said, in effect, "Give me everything you have on phenomenology."
How do you philosophize about an apricot cocktail?
Well, you could start by describing the experience of drinking it, or describing what it is, what it looks like as it's sitting on the table, or you could talk about the waiter who is serving it to you, and that's something that Sartre did go on to do. He wrote in Being and Nothingness, his big work, he included a description of a waiter who's moving through the crowd and delivering drinks on the tray. The tray is perfectly balanced, and he sort of plays the part of the perfect waiter. And this became a little story that Sartre used to introduce his philosophy, or to express an aspect of his philosophy. And I think the big difference between that and the traditional style of philosophy that they'd studied at university and school is that basically it's a lot more fun, but it also gives us something that we can talk about instead of just worrying, as philosophers have tended to, about whether it really exists, whether it's really true, can we know what we think we know? And they just kind of ignore all that and just talk about the actual nitty-gritty of what they're doing.
And is there a name for sort of the predecessor for phenomenology? Was there an ism that they were breaking away from?
Not really, because it was just philosophy, you'd probably say. I mean, it's the tradition that goes back to Descartes in the 17th century, who started really asking, how can we be sure of anything? How can we know what we think we know? It's a fascinating subject, but it tends to be unanswerable. And so ever since then, philosophers have just gone round and round in circles around this question. So it was a big break away from that whole approach into a fresh start.
To take this to a philosophy 101 kind of level, how do you get from phenomenology then to existentialism?
That was a big shift in emphasis because Sartre was interested in describing human experience, but he was particularly interested in questions, for example, like human freedom. What does it mean to be free? And this he'd picked up from a slightly different philosophical tradition, but he applied the methods of phenomenology to that. So he started writing about, well, what is the experience of being free?
And why were they so interested at that point in time, where it's 1932, in the question of freedom?
Well, it's always a topic that I think is of interest to all of us, because being human means being free, having to decide what to do, having to take responsibility for your choices. They were very influenced by Kierkegaard in the previous century, who talked about the dizziness of freedom. The fact that we're free gives us a kind of vertigo, because you're literally sort of almost looking over this cliff of all the possibilities that you have. But that is the human condition. And they weren't very politicized at the time, but of course we are talking about the early 1930s and a period where European culture was in a crisis point. I mean, there'd been the Depression, there was the fear of another war looming already. It had only just come out of the First World War, and Hitler was about to come to power. There was this great sort of anxiety about what was going to come next. And really the political developments and the philosophy kind of went together. They began to merge because the general sense of anxiety in what W.H. Auden called the age of anxiety found an expression, I think, in this philosophy of freedom.
Let's talk about the cast of characters. And when you look at this book, even just from the cover and the end papers and the design, it's almost designed like a movie poster. You deal primarily with 7 major figures, and then there are others. But who are those figures, and how did you decide to focus on them?
There's all sorts of others, actually. There are quite a few people come and go.
But they didn't get lead billing.
But they didn't get lead billing, no. They're the extras, I suppose. The ones that ended up taking really the biggest role, I mean, there's Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, which they're kind of everybody's idea of an existentialist.
Right.
We imagine them sitting in the Parisian cafes and holding court and sort of being, quite glamorous. Albert Camus, who arguably was not an existentialist, he actually said that he wasn't
Right,
one.
he didn't consider himself
But,
one.
He really plays a part in this story. I mean, he's definitely sort of dealing with some of the same themes.
He was
And
at the
part of the
Café.
same group, and he was at the Café, and they were friends until they fell out. Then there's sort of some people from Germany who are part of the story because of the phenomenology, but they also dealt with the same kind of existential questions, some of them. So you've got Martin Heidegger, it's a very big figure in this story. Edmund Husserl was the inventor of phenomenology, became very influential. Karl Jaspers, who again sort of talked about existential issues. And then there's Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He's the other sort of major figure. Again, a phenomenologist more than an existentialist, but he was a part of the same circle in Paris with Sartre and Beauvoir. He tried to understand just the basics of human experience, really, the way that we have a body and we perceive things, and we're not just an abstract disembodied consciousness. And he wrote beautifully about perception and the body, and also childhood and how we grow into our perceptions and we learn things as we grow up, and everything starts from being babies. This is a thing that most philosophers have tended to forget, is that we're not just dropped into the world from a great height as fully formed adults.
Merleau-Ponty is probably a less familiar name, at least in the United States. Who was he? What was his story?
Well, he was friends with Simone de Beauvoir from quite an early age. They studied together. He had quite a happy childhood, or so he always said. which makes him quite unusual among the existentialists.
That seems like that's not a requirement. That's like an anti-requirement for a philosopher.
Well, he said that it left him feeling quite a cheerful sort of a character for life. You know, he came out as a very different sort of a person. And he became very interested in these new philosophical developments. He heard Husserl lecture in Paris, and he went to read Husserl's unpublished papers and was very influenced by that approach to philosophy. So he brought that back to the Parisian scene. But he also he was professor of child psychology at the Sorbonne, so he united psychology and philosophy, again, through this idea of development, the idea of the body and the idea of perception. So in some ways he was a more technical kind of figure. He didn't write so much about freedom or sex or all these kind of subjects that Sartre tended to tackle. He's had a more lasting influence because he's had a big influence on cognitive science, for example. It still uses some of his insights into how we just move around the world and what it is to perceive something.
Your previous book was called How to Live. That's a rather big subject and was a biography of Montaigne. How did you get from that to this book?
Well, there's some similarities between Montaigne's approach to describing his experience and his way of looking back on his life and reflecting it and seeing philosophical ideas as being philosophies of living. The same applies to some of the existentialists. You know, this is a very living philosophy, the kind of philosophy that you do by living it as well as by thinking about it. They're also very interested in experience, how we process our experience, how we understand it, how we might change from moment to moment, which was a subject that fascinated Montaigne too. So there's some quite unexpected points of contact. There's actually a very specific contact which was a link for me, which is that Merleau-Ponty wrote an essay about Montaigne in which he called him basically the first phenomenologist, and because of his way of describing experience.
When you structured the book, you started in 1932, and then you go back in time. How did you figure out how to structure the narrative and tell the story of this group?
Well, I wanted to go back to see where phenomenology came from. So I go back to the early years of the 20th century when phenomenology first began to come together as an idea, in order to then sort of trace various chains of influence. One of the big ones was how Husserl's phenomenology was taken up by Martin Heidegger and made into something completely different. And that was all long before Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir came along and made something yet different again out of it. So I wanted to give an overview of where I think existentialism ended up becoming at its most popular and having its greatest impact. And then to say, well, where did this come from? And a lot of it went back to the 19th century, people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. But I definitely wanted to focus on the 20th century story and really onto what happened when those two strands met, the phenomenology from Germany and the sort of Kierkegaardian angst, because all the angst and anguish and doubt about what one should do, that all is one tradition. But the phenomenological tradition is curiosity about experience, how to describe it, how to get any kind of certainty about it. And I think it's so interesting what happened when those two met.
I would never accuse an author of writing their own jacket copy, but I'm going to read from the jacket copy because it says something that I think would answer an obvious question about the relevance of this today. It says on your jacket copy, but now in the 21st century, we find ourselves again confronting essential questions of identity and freedom, this time in a complex, high-tech world. And perhaps the existentialists have more to say to us than ever. So what do they have to say to us now in this high-tech moment?
Well, the question of technology comes up quite a bit throughout their story, and particularly with the work of Heidegger, who, among his many other things that he attempted to do, and in many ways he's a very disturbing figure in the story, but one thing that he wrote about that I think is so interesting to us is the question of technology, because he wrote about how in order to understand our technology, we really need to understand what it is to be a human being, because humans are so mediated through our technology. And he wrote that at a time when he was thinking about things like typewriters and old-fashioned cinema projectors and radio. I mean, he couldn't even
the
conceive
disruptors of the
anything.
moment.
Yeah, and something like the internet he would never have thought of that, but he would have been fascinated by it because of the way in which it changes human ways of interacting. The fact that we can interact with people in different parts of the world without even ever meeting them, and yet build up these networks. And he would have been quite concerned, I think, by the way that can level everything down sort of to the same level, so that everything becomes stripped of its connection with anything and stripped of sort of content. But it's hugely useful, but it comes at a certain cost in terms of reality or authenticity. It's not that I think that you can take bits of existentialism and kind of stick it onto the modern world.
And it'll
I don't
explain
think that
everything.
it's never going to be that simple with any set of ideas. But I do think that it's really interesting, given our current concerns, to go back and reread them and just think about them in this slightly different context.
Can you give an example?
The whole question of freedom, which is so central to Sartre's thought, is probably the biggest example of that, because there was a while when it seemed as though perhaps freedom was not such a big issue anymore. We all had so much more personal freedom, all the liberation movements, sexual freedom, women's liberation, gay liberation, civil rights movement. It was like there was a feeling of enormous progress. Maybe we've kind of almost got there and there's nothing much left to be talked about. Instead, now I think there's been a big shift of the feeling about freedom. It seems much more problematic again on all kinds of levels. Do we have the freedom to say what we think, even if it offends others? Do we have freedom from surveillance? What's the connection between freedom and privacy? I think those are the kind of questions where it's not like we'll find any easy answers in the Existentialists, but it really helps to go back and kind of think the question through in this really radical way that they did.
Like, what do you think Sartre would have made of these questions and the way they're sort of being confronted again today?
Well, he would have been fascinated, and he probably would have had massive opinions about it, because one thing Sartre was never short of was an opinion on things. He always took some perspective, often quite quickly and quite passionately. And others were a little more cautious. Merleau-Ponty once said to him, you shouldn't come to conclusions quite so instantly on every single issue of the day. But that's what Sartre tried to do. So he would be out there writing editorials, tweeting. His tweets might be a bit long, though. I think he would have difficulty getting it into 140 characters.
I'm sure someone has started a Sartre Twitter feed that's, riffing on what's going on politically today. One final very basic question for those among us who, maybe took a class in existentialism in college and understood it for all of 5 minutes and then completely forgot it or lost their grasp on it. I imagine people say to you, you've written a book about existentialism, like that sounds incredibly complicated and dense, and I couldn't possibly understand it. And what's your response to that?
What I really do in the book is try and retrace my own process of trying to understand it. I came to this stuff very early in life, in my teens, and then studied it in my early 20s at university. And I loved it, but it was a long process to decide what I thought about it and what my response to it all was. And now revisiting it, I'm kind of retracing some of that process, but also I'm responding to it very differently because of being so much older and having done different things in between. So it's a kind of voyage of discovery for me, and I try and convey some of that feeling of discovery and curiosity and to capture some of the excitement that I felt the first time around.
Well, thank you for revisiting it with us. Sarah Bakewell, the author of At the Existentialist Café, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails, reviewed this week in the book review. Sarah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Alexandra Alter has some literary news for us. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So we're going to talk about Jane Inc., right?
Jane Inc., the Jane Austen industrial complex. It's really going into overdrive with the 200th anniversary of her death coming up. And the latest novelist to enter the fray is Curtis Sittenfeld, author of Prep and American Wife. And she got probably the best assignment if you're going to reboot Jane Austen. She rewrote Pride and Prejudice and set it in contemporary Cincinnati.
This is the fourth installment in the series?
Yes, it's the fourth installment. The previous ones have included Emma by Alexander McCall Smith and Northanger Abbey by Val McDermott, which she took a sort of crime novelist approach to it, as well as Sense and Sensibility by Joanna Trollope.
And so what was the draw for Curtis Sittenfeld to do this piece?
You know, when I spoke to her, she said she was initially kind of reluctant. Obviously, she's very well established on her own, so why should she spend her time rewriting someone else's work? And she said she worried a little bit that it would be cheesy. But then she reread the novel, which, you know, she was a huge fan of when she'd read it in high school and later on, and just thought it would be fun. And she could actually envision a way to retell the story in the Midwest in Cincinnati. And she turned Liz into a journalist. Elizabeth Bennet becomes Liz. Darcy is, of course, arrogant as ever, but he's a neurosurgeon. And Bingley, who is the suitor who comes to town in the original and everybody is vying for his affection, is actually a doctor but also a reality dating show contestant. So that's sort of the setup. Everyone knows he's single when he arrives because he's failed to find a wife on this reality dating show. You
mentioned the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's death. What else is on the horizon for Austen fans?
Well, there's a handful of new reboots in the works, including young adult novels based on Mansfield Park and Persuasion. There's a big exhibit happening at the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., which will famously include the shirt that Colin Firth wore in the BBC adaptation when he played Mr. Darcy and plunged into a lake and came out is basically a wet T-shirt, sort of Regency version of a wet T-shirt.
Our story on that was like the most read story that week.
People are excited about the shirt. And another exciting project is Whit Stillman, the filmmaker, has rewritten or sort of written a novelization of Lady Susan, which is a lesser-known Jane Austen work. It's a novella and it's epistolary. And he turned it into a novel and is doing a film adaptation of that, starring Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny.
So Jane Austen wrote, I think, only 6 novels in her lifetime.
Exactly.
What's your favorite?
I have to go with Pride and Prejudice. I know it's an obvious one. But, you know, I think that is part of the reason you see all these rewrites. You don't see it as much for Dickens or Trollope. It's like her canon is so small and people love her work and they want to spend more time with the characters and they want more to sort of imagine what happens after Elizabeth and Darcy get married. And so there's just, you know, sort of endless variations on this theme from zombies to cookbooks to comic books. And, you know, there's sort of every demographic gets their own version of Pride and Prejudice.
Now the fan fiction has gone official.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Many readers know the name Alfred A. Knopf, the storied publishing house that made Langston Hughes, Willa Cather, John Updike, and many other writers into household names. What may be less well known is that in the world the Knopfs moved in, it was an open secret that Blanche Knopf, Alfred's wife, was a huge part of the brains, grace, and sheer drive behind the operation. She was responsible for a good part of the firm's success and its glamour. A new biography of Blanche Knopf is called The Lady with the Boar's Eye, and our reviewer, Liesl Schillinger, is here to talk about it and the amazing Blanche. Hi, Liesl.
Hello, Pamela.
So what was publishing like before the founding of Knopf? Can you tell us a little bit of the backdrop? Who were the major publishers at that time?
The big thing that was different about Knopf was that it was an intellectually ambitious Jewish firm. Before the First World War, the biggest and best publishing houses were pretty waspy. There was Houghton Mifflin, there was Scribner's, there was Doubleday. And so when Alfred and Blanche came along with Knopf, they were breaking a path, being Jewish and creating a publishing house that aspired to the pinnacle of the literary world. They had imitators soon after, though. A company called Liverite was a very big deal.
Which is recently revived.
Exactly. And Liverite also branched off into the modern library at a time, so they kind of started a small trend, you could say. Another thing that was happening, though, at that time was that publishing began to change. The white glove, waspy firms began to change because there was a paper shortage, because it was World War I. And so they started more going into textbooks. So that left an opening for someone with literary ambitions. And also, Alfred was kind of a dandy, and he liked beauty. He was an aesthete. And so he made sure that Knopf books were printed on fine paper and that the covers looked good and that the type was good. He was creating an artifact as well as bringing in literary writers. So,
And was that different from what other publishers were doing in terms of the covers and the sort of overall design at that time?
absolutely. They were originators. And I would say that Blanche also had very good and strong tastes, and they were both aesthetic, but definitely Alfred was very, very forceful in making sure that it was going to be a beautiful imprint as well as an ambitious one.
The argument that Laura Claridge puts forth in this biography is that Blanche Knopf, rather than Alfred, was in many ways the real tastemaker behind Knopf, that she was the one with the fine European literary sense. Let's talk a little bit about who she was. Where did she grow up?
Blanche grew up in Manhattan, in the Upper West Side, I think, and also Upper East Side. Her parents had money. Her father, he made ruffles. He made textiles, cloth of some kind. And she went to a pretty exclusive girls' school called Gardner's, which catered to well-brought-up Jewish girls, but also non-society people from everywhere. So there were some eminent girls. And so she was brought up learning to ride horses, being part of sort of polite society in a certain way in New York. And she met Alfred when she was 17 at some kind of fancy ball out in Long Island near Lawrence, where his family had an estate. So he was also from a wealthy family, and his father.
This helps in publishing.
It helps, yeah. No, it's how pleasant it is to have money. Hey ho, but no, they both had money behind them. Blanche brought money into the marriage, and Alfred's family also had money, but they spent a lot. They threw everything they had into this company, and during the Depression, there were times when they barely broke even, but they always had something to fall back on.
And so they met when she was only 18?
17. And then I told you she went to this fancy girls' school, a kind of finishing school, kind of if you couldn't get into Brearley because of whatever social reason, you went to Gardner's. It was very nice. She was bookish, and she became increasingly bookish in her late teens. She loved reading. She was passionate about it. And so was young Alfred Knopf. And he was also muscular and tan. Their romance seems to be legitimate while they were courting in the early
Once
years.
they were married, it was no longer.
It was out the door. It was gone. No, it was a cold, seething hatred. I'm joking. They didn't get along well at all. That's completely true. But they did bond over books and over their business.
And when did they marry, and when did they found the publishing house?
They got married in April of 1916, but the publishing house was founded a year earlier when they were only engaged. And so I think where some of the confusion may come from when people wonder if she really was pulling her weight equally in Knopf or even more, because it was founded before they were married, but she was always, at least according to this biographer, and she seems to have lots of good backup, Blanche was inseparable from its rise and from really its endurance.
And Claridge's argument in this book is really to say that Blanche was the driving force behind many of the...
What Claridge says is that Blanche was the one who was the literary arbiter. She was the one who had a passion for poetry and for European fiction, and who would also decide which unproven writers, which had original work that she thought was worth publishing. She would bring to American readers books that hadn't been in translation or books they hadn't heard of. She brought Thomas Mann, Buddenbrooks, to America. She got Camus and Sartre and de Beauvoir in English. She had early work of T.S. Eliot published. She went to England a lot. She and Alfred would go on scouting trips. She brought back Muriel Spark, Rebecca West. Elizabeth Bowen became a close friend. And in America, she also championed Willa Cather. Willa Cather actually sought her out and really trusted Blanche's taste. So yes, you're completely right. Laura Claridge makes the case that it was Blanche's literary taste, but that's not to say that Alfred wasn't absolutely crucial. He initially courted John Galsworthy. He was initially friends with H.L. Mencken, who became a very, very close friend of Blanche's. Alfred was a salesman, and he had a vision for how to sell the product. He is into branding. He thought about how the books would look. He thought about posters. He came up with ad campaigns that were very clever in the American Mercury, which is a magazine which Mencken and George Nathan founded. Alfred went on the road. He traveled. He met booksellers. He got great ad campaigns going. He understood the value of publicity for a book and of branding. And so he did a whole lot to make the Knopf name get recognition and to make the Knopf imprint recognizable, to make it to make it admired, but also to get copies sold. So he was always thinking about the bottom line. He would disagree a lot of times with Blanche about which book to buy. If an author asked for too much money, he would get cold feet and back away. He did not want The Wasteland, for example, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which was, you might say, not such a good business decision. But they both had strong opinions. It's just that Alfred cared more about history and music when it came to books, and Blanche was the one who really cared about
literature,
fiction and poetry. Right.
And was Knopf, as a publishing house, as a business, immediately successful?
Well, they did very well pretty early on. They had one hit book their first year called Green Mansions. Early on, they acquired a kind of kooky book, you might think, that had been recommended to them by a friend of Mencken, called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And that book sold millions. And that book has done so much to keep Knopf healthy over the years. And I believe in the book, Claridge writes it was even selling 5,000 copies a week in this new century. So that has been an evergreen, durable cash cow for them.
But the marriage between Blanche and Alfred was not altogether happy.
It sounds like they were not happy physically with each other, and they got on each other's nerves. There seems to have been a clash of wills from very early on. Now, if you look at the correspondence, which is pretty one-sided, it's the correspondence from Blanche to Alfred while he was on the road, you can see her being affectionate with him or teasing, but it seems that when they were in each other's presence, they would goad each other. And she describes the regular meetings at Knopf where Blanche would poke and prod at him to get him to lose his mind, just saying that she was too hot, for example. And so he would grudgingly turn up the heat, and then he would come back to the meeting dressed in a bathing suit and have the rest of the meeting dressed like that to make his point. They kind of feuded. At the same time, they both loved this company, and that was where their first loyalty went. They had a son whom they called Pat. That doesn't seem like they were the warmest parents, but he came into the business, eventually, and then formed his own company. Yes?
Why was the correspondence one-sided? Was Claridge unable to have access to Alfred's letters?
I doubt that. It seems to me there's a point made that Alfred didn't really write her very often, or he would write little brief communiques of a few words. She was the greater letter writer by nature. She was extremely social, though, and he was retiring. Not too long into the marriage, he got his own place. Well, it was their place, but it was in Westchester, in Purchase, out of town, and he really liked to go there. She kept up an apartment on 57th Street. She had different addresses over the years, but from very early on, she loved to entertain. She was a jazz baby. She would have Gershwin, who was a friend, playing piano till 3 a.m. at her parties. Paul Robeson, he would sing. She had Stravinsky came to one of her parties. She would dance until the wee hours of morning, and she loved to entertain. And the literary and performing world, black and white, she was very ahead of the game in being racially aware and inclusive, would come to her apartment. She really was a saloniste as well as a publisher. You can tell from this book that she had many, many significant close friendships, but she could also be remote, hard to know, frightening. I'm not so sure that she was the warmest and fuzziest person in the world, but she definitely was warmer and fuzzier than Alfred.
But the book is full of lots of sort of juicy anecdotes about the parties of the time, about her relationships with all of these writers. What was your favorite?
The thing that struck me really the most was how many love affairs she had. I don't think that publishing is like this. I don't think America is like this. I mean, I think you get outside of the Kardashians. I don't know where this happens. But she had serious love affairs with Stokowski, with Jascha Heifetz, with Benno Moisevich, with a European playboy named Hoa, whom she was very, very in love with. And that went on for quite a while. And apparently, Alfred just turned a blind eye. And even the stories that are included in the book from friends of hers who would describe in this jaded way the goings-on of the 1920s amid the illustrious writers we've all come to think of as just august names, were really scandalous and shocking and fun. And I was surprised that a woman who was so tightly wound and intense and driven also let loose so wildly.
Well, I guess given the acknowledgement, or the lack of acknowledgement that she got from Alfred during her lifetime, this book is a kind of revenge because it's the first biography of Blanche Knopf, and there still isn't a biography of Alfred.
She won, you might say. There's clearly a lot to say about Alfred, and we learn in this book that he saw prostitutes, he had his own private life. There are all kinds of bad behaviors of his that are alluded to in the book. It would be definitely pretty interesting to see Alfred's side.
And probably something more about the books, too.
Well, and also I don't want to underplay how much is in this biography about the books, because the books were really Blanche's life, and they were Alfred's life. And as much as this is a chronicle of a difficult, fractious, quarrelsome, disharmonious marriage, it's also the blow-by-blow show of how this woman, with her husband, hunted great writers and made this publishing house.
The book again is The Lady with the Borzoi, Blanche Knopf, Literary Tastemaker Extraordinaire by Laura Claridge. Reviewed this week by Liesl Schillinger.
Thanks, Pamela.
Greg Cowles has bestseller news. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new on the list this week?
There is a lot of new life, perfect for spring. Starting with a debut novel on the hardcover fiction list, down at number 15. It's called Lilac Girls by Martha Hall Kelly. It is based on the real-life story of Caroline Faraday, who was an actress and philanthropist back during World War II and who saved some Polish women from concentration camps. And so this is a novel based on that story, new at number 15. Then at number 14, the Mary Russell series by Laurie R. King continues with The Murder of Mary Russell. This is the 15th book in that series about the fictional Sherlock Holmes and his wife, Mary Russell. Then at number 7, Stuart Woods continues his Stone Barrington series.
How many books are there in that series?
Another series novel. 37 books.
Whoa.
This one, Family Jewels, is the 37th in the series. He comes out with about 3 a year. They all hit the list. This one's new at number 7. Then not a series novel, new at number 6. Anna Quinlan is back with a book called Miller's Valley that looks at a woman's attempt to keep the family's property in an environmentally endangered valley. New at number 5 on the list, back to series novels. Steve Barry has the 11th book in his Cotton Malone series. It's called The 14th Colony. At number 2, the paranormal romance novelist J.R. Ward continues her Black Dagger Brotherhood series. Book 14 of that series is called The Beast. It's new at number 2. She recently described this series for the website She Knows as warrior vampires in black leather pants falling for females who hand their butts to them on a plate. And then finally, not a series novel, new at number 1 this week. Mary Higgins Clark is back with a novel called As Time Goes By.
And what's new on nonfiction?
Starting down at number 16, Dan Lyons, a tech writer who took a job at a startup, wrote a memoir about that experience called Disrupted, looking at business in the tech age.
And he had a really nice piece in the Sunday Review that I think
maybe came from that book. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Then all the way up at number 7, another Sunday Review contributor recently, Hope Yarin, the geobiologist who has written a lot about sexism in science, and that's what she wrote about for Sunday Review, has a memoir that's avowedly not about sexism in science, although she touches briefly on the subject. But it's really just a memoir of her life in science and her fascination with plants. It's called Lab Girl.
We talked to her last week from Hawaii.
That's new at number 7. New at number 5, the longtime CBS correspondent, the 60 Minutes correspondent Lesley Stahl, has a memoir called Becoming Grandma, which is about life with her grandchildren, a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. As we'll find out in a second, she's not the only TV journalist with a family story new on this week's list. But first, new at number 3, all 3 of the top nonfiction titles this week are debuts to the list. So starting at number 3, Steve Case, who founded AOL, has a look at where technology is headed called The Third Wave. Then at number 2, another big tech entrepreneur and magnate, Arianna Huffington, who founded the Huffington Post, has a book called The Sleep Revolution, looking at what science tells us about our need for sleep. And finally, the other TV anchor that I was talking about, Anderson Cooper of CNN has a book with his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, called The Rainbow Comes and Goes. And that's kind of an extended conversation between mother and son that has also been turned into a TV show that's been getting a lot of attention.
What does the title refer to?
It sounds kind of like a fortune cookie saying, doesn't it? It's this kind of gnomic title.
Or a Kermit the Frog song?
I think it's just saying that sometimes life is good and sometimes it's not so good. And you take it when you can get it.
All right, we'll leave on that little happy note. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.